September 17th, 1944. Somewhere over the Netherlands. The fog came in fast. 1 minute, Flying Officer David MacKenzie could see the Dutch countryside clearly below him. Fields divided by canals, small towns with church spires, roads with German military vehicles moving south. The next minute, everything disappeared. White. Complete white. MacKenzie was flying at 800 feet when the fog swallowed him. He pulled back on the stick instinctively, climbing to 2,000 feet to get clear. The fog followed him up. He climbed to 4,000 feet, still white. He checked his compass. His radio compass was giving him a reading that didn't match his last known position. Something was wrong with the instrument. He had been flying for 2 hours and 40 minutes since leaving RAF Eindhoven. He had enough fuel for another 35 minutes. He was somewhere over the Netherlands, or possibly Belgium, or possibly Germany. He genuinely didn't know. MacKenzie was 23 years old and came from a small town called Truro in Nova Scotia. His father ran a lumber mill. His mother taught piano lessons to children who didn't want to learn piano. MacKenzie grew up in the kind of quiet maritime town where nothing much happened and everyone knew everyone else's business. He learned to fly at 18 in a borrowed Tiger Moth at a small airfield outside town. He joined the RCAF in 1941 and flew his first combat mission over France in March 1943. By September 1944, he had flown 89 combat missions and shot down 7 German aircraft. He was experienced enough to be dangerous and young enough to believe experience would keep him alive. His squadron, 402 Squadron RCAF, was flying ground attack missions over the Netherlands in support of Operation Market Garden. MacKenzie's job that morning was to attack a German supply convoy reported near Arnhem. He found the convoy. He attacked it. He destroyed 2 trucks and damaged 3 more. Then the fog came. He climbed above the fog and tried to get his bearings. The radio compass gave him a heading. He followed it. After 20 minutes, the heading was clearly wrong. He turned 180 degrees and flew back. His fuel gauge was showing 20 minutes of flying time remaining. He needed to find an airfield, any airfield. He began descending through the fog, looking for the ground. He broke through the fog base at 600 feet. Below him was flat Dutch farmland, canals, fields, a road with no vehicles, and 1 kilometer ahead, clearly visible through the thinning fog, an airfield. MacKenzie felt enormous relief. He turned toward it and began his approach. The field had 2 runways, several hangars, and aircraft parked in dispersal areas. MacKenzie was 400 meters out on final approach when he saw the aircraft clearly for the first time. Focke-Wulf 190s, German fighters, painted with German markings, parked in neat rows beside a hangar with a large swastika painted on the side. MacKenzie stared at this for approximately 2 seconds. Then he was on the runway, and it was too late to go around. His Spitfire touched down on a German airfield at 130 miles per hour. He applied the brakes immediately, but the runway was wet from the fog, and the Spitfire slid. He used differential braking to steer away from a hangar on his right. The aircraft slowed, 60 miles per hour, 40. He was rolling slowly down the center of the runway on a German airfield with approximately 15 minutes of fuel remaining and no plan whatsoever. MacKenzie's first instinct was to open the throttle and take off immediately. He pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared. The Spitfire began accelerating. Then he looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was touching the red. If he took off now, he would run out of fuel before reaching Allied lines. He pulled the throttle back and let the aircraft slow to a stop at the end of the runway. He sat in his cockpit for approximately 15 seconds and thought. The fog was still thick over the airfield. Visibility was maybe 200 meters. He could not be seen clearly from the hangars. His Spitfire was at the far end of the runway, distant from the main buildings. MacKenzie made a decision that he later described as possibly the least rational decision he ever made. and simultaneously the only rational option available. He taxied his Spitfire toward the hangar area, parked it next to a Focke-Wulf 190, climbed out of the cockpit and walked into the German airfield, pretending he was supposed to be there. He was wearing his RCAF flight suit, blue-grey color. His helmet was standard RAF issue. His Mae West life jacket was the same design used by both Allied and German pilots. From a distance, in fog, moving with purpose, he looked like a pilot who had just landed and was walking to the operations building. He walked toward the nearest hangar. A German ground crewman appeared from around the corner and looked at him. MacKenzie nodded. The German nodded back and kept walking. MacKenzie kept walking. He had no plan. He was making decisions one step at a time. The hangar door was open. MacKenzie walked in. Inside were two Focke-Wulf 190s in various states of maintenance. 3 German mechanics were working on one of them. They looked up when MacKenzie entered. He nodded and kept walking as if he had a destination. He walked the full length of the hangar, out the other side, and found himself in a courtyard between the hangar and the operations building. A German officer was walking toward him, a Hauptmann, a captain, Luftwaffe uniform with pilot's wings, looking directly at MacKenzie. He said something in German. MacKenzie said, "Ja," and nodded and kept walking. The German officer stopped and called after him. MacKenzie turned the corner around the operations building and found himself looking at something that changed everything. A fuel bowser. A German fuel truck parked beside the operations building, connected to a fuel outlet on the wall. A German airman was standing beside it, smoking a cigarette. The airman was 19 years old, with a round face and large ears, and the look of someone who had been assigned to fuel duty because nobody had found anything more important for him to do. His name was Georg Bauer. MacKenzie walked straight to the fuel bowser. Bauer looked at him. MacKenzie pointed at the direction he had come from and said the only German aviation word he knew. Spitfire. Spitfire. Bauer stared at him. MacKenzie repeated it. Spitfire. Kraftstoff. Fuel. The German word for fuel he had seen on a captured document once and remembered for no particular reason. Bauer stared at him for a very long moment. The moment stretched. MacKenzie felt his heart beating in his ears. Then Bauer laughed. He said something MacKenzie didn't understand. Then he disconnected the fuel hose from the wall outlet and started walking toward the runway. Toward MacKenzie's Spitfire. MacKenzie followed him. Bauer walked to the Spitfire and looked at it carefully. He examined the fuel cap location with the practical interest of a man whose job was fueling aircraft and who had just encountered an aircraft type he had never fueled before. He found the fuel cap. He opened it. He inserted the nozzle. He began fueling the enemy aircraft with German aviation fuel. MacKenzie stood beside his aircraft while this happened. He kept his face neutral and watched the fog. The visibility had improved slightly, maybe 300 meters now. If it improved much more, someone from the main buildings would be able to see his RCAF markings clearly. Bauer worked methodically. He checked the flow rate. He watched the gauge on the bowser. He was doing his job with the same thoroughness he brought to every fueling task, regardless of which country had built the aircraft. MacKenzie watched him and thought he had never felt simultaneously more grateful and more terrified in his life. Bauer finished fueling and tapped the side of the aircraft twice in the universal gesture of done. He said something and gestured toward the aircraft in a way that clearly meant, "You're welcome, off you go." MacKenzie nodded. He climbed into the cockpit, started the engine. The Merlin roared. MacKenzie looked at the fuel gauge. Full. He looked at the fog. He looked at Bauer, who was already walking back toward the operations building with his fuel hose over his shoulder. He looked at the runway. Then, the Hauptmann he had passed in the courtyard came running out of the operations building, shouting something at Bauer. Bauer stopped walking and turned. The Hauptmann was pointing at the Spitfire on the runway. Bauer looked at the Spitfire. He looked at his fuel hose. A visible expression of understanding crossed his face as he realized what he had just done. MacKenzie pushed the throttle forward. The Spitfire rolled down the runway and lifted into the fog at exactly the moment the Hauptmann reached Bauer and grabbed his arm. MacKenzie pulled the aircraft into a steep climb and disappeared into the fog at 500 feet. He flew west for 20 minutes and broke out of the fog into clear sky over Allied territory. His hands were shaking so badly he had difficulty holding the stick. He landed at RAF Eindhoven 12 minutes later. He climbed out of the cockpit and sat down on the wing with his head between his knees. When his legs worked again, he walked to the intelligence section and sat down across from Flight Lieutenant Patterson. "I need to tell you something," MacKenzie said. "I'm not entirely sure you'll believe it." Patterson wrote 14 pages of notes. The airfield MacKenzie had accidentally landed on was Deelen, one of the most important Luftwaffe night fighter bases in the Netherlands. Allied intelligence had been trying to get accurate information about Deelen for 6 months. MacKenzie had walked around it for 40 minutes. He had seen aircraft types, maintenance facilities, fuel storage locations, anti-aircraft gun positions, approximately 35 aircraft on the field. He had done accidentally and without any training what a trained spy might spend weeks trying to accomplish. The intelligence report went to RAF Bomber Command within 48 hours. On September 23rd, 6 days after MacKenzie's accidental landing, 47 Lancaster bombers attacked Deelen using the intelligence he had provided. The attack destroyed the primary fuel storage facility, 2 hangars, and 14 aircraft on the ground. Deelen's night fighter capacity was reduced by 60% for the next 6 weeks. Allied bomber losses on the Rhine approaches dropped by 23% during that period. MacKenzie received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation described a reconnaissance mission under extremely difficult conditions. It did not describe a pilot who was lost in fog and talked a German airman into fueling his aircraft using 3 words of German. The actual circumstances remained classified until 1967. MacKenzie flew 34 more combat missions and finished the war with 123 total missions and 9 aerial victories. He returned to Truro in August 1945 and worked at his father's lumber mill for 2 years. Then he became a bush pilot in northern Ontario. He spent 25 years flying supplies to remote mining and logging camps. He was good at it, experienced at improvisation, good at making quick decisions with incomplete information. He never talked about Deelen. When the story was declassified in 1967, he was 46 years old and living in Sudbury and had no particular interest in publicity. He thought the story reflected more luck than skill. "I got lost," he told his son once. "I landed somewhere I shouldn't have. I improvised badly. It worked out. That's all." Georg Bauer went home to his village near Frankfurt in June 1945. He was 20 years old. He got a job at a gas station because fueling vehicles was the only skill he had developed during 2 years of Luftwaffe service. He worked at the gas station for 3 years. Then he got a better job at a transport company maintaining their fleet of trucks. He was good with vehicles, methodical and practical in the way that people are good at things they learned under pressure. He got married in 1951. He had 3 children. He bought a small house near Frankfurt and lived a quiet life that had nothing remarkable about it, except one morning in September 1944 that he thought about sometimes when he was fueling a truck and his mind wandered. In 1971, a German aviation magazine published an interview with a former Deelen airfield veteran about the September 1944 bombing. The veteran described the bombing in detail. He mentioned that Allied intelligence about the airfield had been unusually precise. He speculated that a spy had been involved. The article reached a wide readership among German aviation enthusiasts. Bauer read it at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning. He read the part about the precise intelligence. He put the magazine down. He picked it up and read it again. He thought about a September morning in 1944, a pilot who walked out of the fog and said, "Spitfire" and "Kraftstoff," and stood beside his aircraft while Bauer fueled it. The pilot whose aircraft Bauer had fueled had provided the intelligence that destroyed the airfield. Bauer sat at his kitchen table for a long time after he understood this. Then he told his wife. She stared at him. "You fueled a Spitfire," she said. "Yes," Bauer said. "I thought someone in authority had authorized it." His wife continued to stare at him. "You fueled a Spitfire," she said again. Bauer nodded. "In my defense," he said, "the fog was very thick." In 1973, Bauer wrote a letter to a German Aviation History Society describing what he remembered from September 17, 1944. The letter was published in the Society's newsletter. A copy reached Dr. Robert Lawson, the Canadian aviation historian who was researching RCAF operations in the Netherlands. Lawson had already found Mackenzie's DFC citation and Patterson's intelligence report. He had Mackenzie's side of the story. Now he had Bauer's. He wrote to Bauer in Frankfurt and asked if he would be willing to be interviewed. Bauer agreed. Lawson traveled to Frankfurt in 1974 and sat across a table from Georg Bauer in his small house near Frankfurt. Bauer was 49 years old. He described the morning in precise detail. The fog, the pilot who appeared from nowhere, the word Spitfire, the decision to get the fuel hose, the Hauptmann running out of the building, the realization on his face of what he had just done. Lawson asked Bauer the central question. "Why did you fuel the aircraft? You must have known something was wrong." Bauer thought about this carefully. "The pilot walked toward me with purpose," he said. "He knew the word for his aircraft and the word for fuel. He seemed to know what he was doing. In the military, you assume that if someone is doing something, someone with authority has authorized it. I was 19 years old. I had been trained to fuel aircraft when pilots needed fuel. A pilot needed fuel. I fueled the aircraft." He paused. "Also," he said, "I think I knew something was unusual. But it was foggy and confusing, and the rational thing seemed to be to do my job. Sometimes the rational thing and the correct thing are not the same." Lawson asked if he was angry about what happened, about the bombing that followed. Bauer shook his head slowly. 14 aircraft destroyed on the ground, he said. 14 aircraft that didn't fly against Allied bombers, against British and Canadian boys in Lancasters. I don't know. Maybe I saved some lives by fueling that Spitfire. Maybe the calculation is more complicated than I am equipped to do. Lawson's book was published in 1980. The chapter about Mackenzie was called The Accidental Spy. Lawson sent a copy to Mackenzie in Sudbury and a copy to Bauer in Frankfurt. Mackenzie read it and called Lawson. He had two questions. The first was whether Lawson had confirmed that the pilot Bauer described was definitely him. Lawson said yes. The details matched exactly. The word Spitfire, the location of the fuel cap, the timing. It was Mackenzie. Mackenzie's second question was whether Lawson had an address for Bauer. Lawson gave it to him. Mackenzie sat at his kitchen table in Sudbury and wrote a letter to Georg Bauer in Frankfurt. He wrote it in English because his German was still limited to approximately 20 words. He wrote simply, "My name is David MacKenzie. I was the pilot whose aircraft you fueled on September 17th, 1944. I have wanted to say something to you for 36 years. Thank you. Not for fueling the aircraft. For not asking questions that would have gotten us both killed. For just doing your job in a confusing situation. I have thought about that morning many times. I have thought about you many times. I hope your life has been good. Bauer received the letter 3 weeks later. He read it at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning, as he had read the magazine article 9 years earlier. He sat there for a long time. Then he called his wife. He read it to her. She said he should write back. He wrote back in German, which his daughter translated into English. He wrote that he was glad to know Mackenzie's name, that he had thought about that morning many times also, that he had spent years trying to decide if what he did was foolish or fortunate, or both, that he was glad Mackenzie survived the war, that he was glad the war ended, that he hoped Mackenzie's life had been good too. They exchanged letters for 4 years. Mackenzie's letters were written in English, Bauer's letters were written in German and translated by his daughter, who found the correspondence increasingly interesting as she understood more about what her father had done in 1944. In 1984, Mackenzie wrote to Bauer and asked if he would like to meet. He was 63 years old and retired from bush flying. He had never been to Germany. He thought he might like to see it from the ground for once. Bauer wrote back immediately, "Come whenever you want. I will show you Frankfurt." Mackenzie flew to Frankfurt in September 1984, exactly 40 years after the morning at Dielen. He landed at Frankfurt Airport and walked through the arrivals gate and looked for a man he had never met but had been writing to for 4 years. Bauer was 59 years old, shorter than Mackenzie had imagined, round-faced. The large ears that had been prominent at 19 were still prominent at 59. He was holding a small sign that said Mackenzie in careful block letters. Mackenzie walked to him. They shook hands. Neither said anything for a moment. Then Bauer said in English, which he had been practicing for months specifically for this moment, "Next time you need fuel, please ask properly." Mackenzie laughed. It was a real laugh that came from somewhere deep. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. They spent a week together in Frankfurt. Bauer showed Mackenzie the city. They visited the transport company where Bauer still worked part-time as a consultant. They ate meals at Bauer's kitchen table where his wife served them food and watched the 2 old men talk through his daughter's translations with the expression of a woman who had heard this story many times and still found it slightly unbelievable. On the 3rd day, Bauer suggested they drive to the Netherlands, to Dielen. Mackenzie was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. They drove to the Netherlands and found the site of the former airfield. Dielen had been a Dutch Royal Air Force base after the war and had closed in 1994. In 1984, it was still operational. They couldn't enter the base, but they stood outside the fence and looked at the runways through the chain link. The runways where Mackenzie had landed in Focke 40 years earlier. The hangars where he had walked past German mechanics. The buildings where the Hauptmann had come running.
Bauer pointed to a spot near one of the hangars. "That is approximately where the fuel bowser was," he said through his daughter's translation. Mackenzie looked at the spot. "That is approximately where I landed," he said, pointing to the far end of the runway. They stood at the fence and looked at the airfield for a long time without talking. 2 old men looking at a place that connected them across 40 years and a war and 2 countries and a fog that came in fast on a September morning. On the last evening before Mackenzie flew home, they sat in Bauer's kitchen, and his wife brought coffee, and the daughter sat with them to translate. Mackenzie asked the question he had been building toward all week. When you realized what you had done, when you read the magazine article in 1971 and understood, what did you feel? Bauer was quiet for a long time. His wife watched him. His daughter waited with her pen. "I felt many things," Bauer said finally. "I felt foolish. I felt that I had been deceived, even though I had not been told anything untrue. You said Spitfire. Your aircraft was a Spitfire. You said Kraftstoff. You needed fuel. Everything you said was accurate." He paused. "I also felt something that surprised me. I felt that maybe things happened the way they should have happened. The airfield was used to shoot down Allied bombers, boys in Lancasters.
After the bombing, it could do this less effectively for 6 weeks. If I had stopped you, if I had asked the right questions, those boys in Lancasters might have died. I don't know this, but I think about it. He looked at Mackenzie directly. I think you landing on that airfield was an accident, but I think me fueling your aircraft was also an accident. And I think the result of those 2 accidents was probably correct, even if the process was completely insane. Mackenzie flew back to Sudbury the next morning. He continued writing to Bauer until Bauer died in 1998 at age 73. Mackenzie attended his funeral in Frankfurt. He stood in a German church and listened to a German funeral service for a man who had fueled his aircraft in 1944 and spent 36 years thinking about whether he had done the right thing. Bauer's daughter gave a eulogy that mentioned her father's long correspondence with a Canadian pilot and described their meeting in 1984. She said her father had told her that meeting Mackenzie was one of the most important things that happened to him after the war, that it had resolved something he had been carrying for 40 years, that knowing Mackenzie survived and lived a good life made the morning at Deelen feel like something that turned out correctly, despite being completely impossible. Mackenzie died in 2003 at age 82. His son donated his logbooks to the Canadian War Museum. The entry for September 17, 1944 reads, Pilot Officer Mackenzie, Spitfire 9, departed Eindhoven 0840. Weather deteriorated. Navigation error. Diverted. Returned Eindhoven 1312. Debriefed intel. DFC recommended. One line. For a morning that produced 14 pages of intelligence, contributed to an attack that saved dozens of Allied bomber crews, and connected 2 men across 40 years and 2 continents, and a fog that came in fast over the Netherlands. Mackenzie always thought 1 line was the appropriate amount of space. He had been lost. He had landed somewhere he shouldn't. A young German had fueled his aircraft without asking the right questions. He had flown home. Everything else that followed, the intelligence and the bombing and the letters and Frankfurt and standing at the fence at Deelen looking at old runways, all of it followed from those 2 accidents in fog. Sometimes accidents lead somewhere. Sometimes the fog takes you exactly where you need to go, even when you have no idea where you are.